To set the scene of Hannibal's rise and to understand the world around him, we have to understand the origins of the geopolitical conflict that dominated his world. On the one side, we have Carthage, a great port city and heir to the ancient Phoenician legacy of seafaring and trade. By the 5th century BCE, it was an important power with colonies and client states across North Africa, Spain, and the Western Mediterranean. Opposing her was Rome, a city-state that had rapidly conquered the Italian peninsula and was ready to leap beyond the confines of Italy. These two great states would, by the 3rd century BCE, find themselves eyeing each other warily over control of the whole central Mediterranean. Their rivalry would culminate in the Punic Wars, which spanned more than a century and the entirety of Hannibal's life. Now, despite this enmity that happened later, Carthage and Rome enjoyed many centuries of peace, from the 6th to the 3rd century BCE, as the Mediterranean world became ever more closely linked through trade and exchange. Cities like Rome and Carthage were often allied and had both grown wealthy from long periods of peaceful interaction. Yet it was an unstable world with great empires and cities rising and falling, and large migrations of people. Perhaps the most destabilizing event was the rise and death of Alexander the Great, who almost a century before Hannibal's birth had remade the map of the known world. The consequences would soon be felt in the Western Mediterranean, and Carthage was drawn into new conflicts as it sought, like many of her neighbors, to protect and expand her holdings. Archaeological discoveries of sunken ships scattered along the floor of the Mediterranean coast provide evidence of a big jump in the sheer number of vessels sailing the sea, mostly for trade, but there was also an expansion in the number and the size of warships in this period. The typical warship of this era was driven by 3 banks of oars. These were each manned by separate oarsmen. Now, this type of vessel is well known. It's known as a trireme, and it acted as the primary warship in the Mediterranean. That was until quadriremes took their place in the 4th century. These new ships, as described by Aristotle, were actually a Carthaginian innovation. Quadriremes had 2 compartments of oars that were manned by 2 people per oar. So just imagine how that shifted the power and the speed of the vessels. These quadriremes were then followed by quinquiremes. It's still open to debate exactly how these quinquiremes operated, but the general understanding is that they had either 2 or 3 separate compartments for oars, and they were operated by 5 people on each side. These ships and their successors were initially the flagships for naval commanders in the mid-3rd century. According to Polybius, quinquiremes were considered the new standard warship for the Carthaginian navy, but this may be an exaggeration. Ancient sources tell us of even bigger ships than 5s, called hexaremes and septaremes, 6s and 7s. In this period, they thrived as well. So a naval arms race was taking place in the Mediterranean, and Carthage and Rome were soon swept up in it. Alexander the Great didn't just spark a naval arms race. He also created a role model for generations of military and political leaders. Many sought to embody the same style of heroic and aggressive leadership. It's certain that Hannibal, like almost all boys of status at the time, would have been brought up on tales of Alexander's exploits. What young boy wouldn't be captivated by his exotic conquests in faraway lands? One such boy was Pyrrhus, who grew up to become the king of the Greek state of Epirus about 50 years before Hannibal's birth. And he epitomized the warrior ruler of this era, a brilliant military mind. Pyrrhus embarked on a series of campaigns around Greece and Macedon and the Eastern Mediterranean. But Pyrrhus soon came west. He was called to aid the city-states of Magna Graecia in southern Italy, who were soon to be faced with an increasingly powerful Roman Republic that was threatening their independence. Pyrrhus may have seen an opportunity to carve for himself an Italian empire, and he landed on the peninsula with a great army, sparking what would be known as the Pyrrhic Wars, and these lasted from 280 to 275 BCE. Now, Pyrrhus was one of the greatest generals of the era. He rarely was defeated in the field, and for a time, he wrested control over southern Italy from the Romans. He then turned his sights on Sicily, following entreaties from another Greek city-state, Syracuse, to come and help them drive the Carthaginians and their allies from the west of the island. Finding common cause in a mutual enemy, Rome and Carthage in fact engaged in a strategic alliance to jointly face this threat at this moment. In Sicily, Pyrrhus was successful in almost every battle encounter he had. Yet years of warfare, attrition, and unpopularity amongst his new subjects took their toll. And Pyrrhus could no longer hold on to what he had gained. He retreated to Epirus in 275 BC. Now, instead of celebrating the defeat of Pyrrhus' comrades in arms, the Roman historian Cassius Dio notes that in the chaos left behind, Rome and Carthage began to see each other not as allies, but as rivals for primacy over Sicily. Pyrrhus is even alleged to have noted on his departure, "What a battlefield we're leaving for the Carthaginians and the Romans." As the great general predicted, war would indeed flare up between Rome and Carthage just 9 years after his departure. The conflict that broke out is known today as the First Punic War, and it endured for 23 years. It was so epic in scale that it drastically reshaped the balance of geopolitical power in the central Mediterranean. Hannibal would be born into the final years of this war, and understanding it is key to understanding his career and the Carthaginian mindset into which he was born. It's certain that Rome and Carthage never planned to engage in a war of such magnitude when it all kicked off in 264 BCE. It's often compared to World War I, where none of the major powers could have imagined how far-reaching its ramifications would be. Polybius, the main source for the history of the First Punic War, noted, and I'm quoting, "We shall find that never before in the history of the world have two such immense forces been ranged against one another at sea." Now, this is certainly hyperbolic, as the world, in this case, is really just the island of Sicily and the central Mediterranean, which was the principal theater of the war, and the prize the two sides were fighting for. But remember that controlling Sicily meant control of the whole central Mediterranean zone and the shipping lanes east and west across the sea. So the complexity of the situation on the ground is best told by the incident that sparked the outbreak of the war in the strategic port city of Messana, which is today's Messina in the northeast corner of Sicily. The faction left in control there by Pyrrhus was a group of mercenaries called the Mamertines. They were facing an army headed by Syracuse. Now, Syracuse was a powerful independent city-state on the island who wanted these mercenaries out. So the Mamertines hedged their bets by seeking protection from both Carthage and Rome. Carthage arrived first, being close by on their base of Lipara in the Aeolian Islands. But then the Mamertines, who were of Campanian extraction, decided to shift to Rome when that city later decided to send assistance too. Snubbed and not willing to accept Roman influence over this key port so close to Lipara, the Carthaginians responded by allying with the Syracusans, and war broke out. We have copies of pre-existing treaties between Rome and Carthage that acknowledge that Sicily fell within Carthaginian sphere of influence. But the Romans decided to come to the aid of the Mamertines and crossed from Italy to give their support anyway. Doing so not only gave Rome exposure to battle off the Italian soil, but it also served as a pivotal moment for its growing imperial aims. Polybius saw the significance, and he begins his history of the period with these words: "I shall take as the starting point of this book the first occasion on which the Romans crossed the sea from Italy."